Hello. I wanted to talk about Braiding Sweetgrass. I had a class here at Stanford about that book, and it, I, of course, read it before class, and I was really surprised to see during class how everyone loved that book. And it surprised me not because I didn't think there is people who like this book because of course I read the reviews before class and I knew that this book is extremely successful. But I expected from people who are quote unquote trained in critical thinking, I thought that they would be a little critical about what the book says, because we usually are. I mean, in every class, regardless of what we're discussing, we're always critical of what we're reading, and we put forward pros and cons of each book, each argument. But with this one, something else happened. It was this attitude of absolutely everyone. They loved the book, but it was a very interesting kind of love and the way they talked about it. And that's the moment when I realized, okay, this is exactly what fetishism looks like in its purest form. Maybe it is what fetishism looks like in its purest form. And um, not only fetishism, because of course it has its conceptual difficulties, but ideology. And I tried to, we had to write a response before the class, so I made it clear that I didn't like the book for several reasons, that I thought it was perverse. And then during class, I abstained myself from saying anything because I knew that was going to offend people if I told them what I thought about the book. But then someone brought a really interesting anecdote to the class, and then I had to speak. And then I will, of course, read the critique that I just wrote after that. And that will be my, I don't know what it will be because it's doesn't have the structure of an academic publishable article. It's just something I needed that I had to write. So the anecdote basically before reading that is that the presenter of the book that day, he went to a little bookstore and he saw two women at the bookstore just talking about that book and saying that they didn't enjoy reading like beyond page 100 or 150 or 200 because it's a really long book. It's almost 400 pages. And then there's a conversation between them, and one of them says to the other, but you know what? It's the kind of book that you just always come back to and you read it slowly. And it's like a Bible. And then that's what I was thinking about. It's like a Bible of capitalism. It's like a Bible of capitalist ethics as we are seeing it today. Then I felt I had to write something about it. And then I remembered that this might be my favorite Zizek quotation. Something that when he spoke, I think it was at NYU, and he was speaking and he said, the first step, this was kind of the first thing that came to mind when I thought I needed to write something about it. He said, the first step, so Zizek said, and I open a quotation here, the first step of really fighting colonialism is to treat them, the others, as ordinary, dirty, evil people as we are, I think the most refined and disgusting form of colonialism today is that hippie fake respect, which I claim is just inverted racism, like celebrating Native Americans here. Oh my god, against the same bullshit, They speak with the spirit of the mountain. They don't just. They know that nature is their mother. They don't just exploit her and so on. One of them, of my Indian friends, told me we ruined much more nature, we killed more buffaloes, we burned more forests. They hate this patronizing, respectful attitude. Although colonialism was a brutal wound, the solution is not to return back, but precisely to see this deprivation, being deprived of ethnic roots, as a unique chance of freedom. And then, what I attempted to do was to criticize this Robin Wall Kimmerer book by showing how its conceptual seriousness, well, there is no conceptual seriousness, first of all. So showing this and then approaching it from a critical conceptual standpoint. So my first line of reasoning was why Braiding Sweetgrass is as classically ideological as any prospect of palingenetic ultranationalism. And I started saying that his 2013 contribution to the Oxford Handbook of Political Ideologies, titled Green Ideology, Matthew Humphrey responds to the reluctance to treat ecological politics as any ideology or on par with conservatism, liberalism, or socialism. He asserts that green ideology is an ideology much like any other, and that the call to develop a planetary consciousness to rediscover our links with the Earth and to act in harmony with the organic is as classically ideological as any prospect of palingenetic ultranationalism. The rhetorical playbook of environmentalism text of environmentalist texts has been well established since the 1980s, often relying on a selective or biased empirical claims. As Bjorn Lomborg notes, the author of False Alarm, the so-called environmental litany, the narrative environmentalists deploy to inspire concern and mobilize action, is fundamentally flawed. This litany, he explains, tells a tale of human-made fall from a state of balance, a potentially catastrophic interference with the cycles and harmonies of the natural world. Robin Wall Kimmerer writes within the established narrative framework and contributes little that is conceptually new, aside from constructing an indigenous environmentalist perspective. I will argue that Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, while presenting itself as an indigenous environmentalist critique, produces a new form of ecofetishism. Rather than challenging the capitalist system fundamentally, it offers a shift in perception, an ideological aesthetic that frames the nature and reciprocity as gifts within a capitalist framework. This reframing masks the contradictions inherent in capitalism, replacing systematic critique with a softened, reciprocal eco-ethics that ultimately supports and sustains the expansion of capitalist logics. The second line of reasoning is that capitalism is always reframed capitalism, not consumerism, which is one of my frequent thoughts when people speak here, especially in university, about capitalism, because they're supposed to have read Weber. They're supposed to know that capitalism always works as a self-refrained kind of capitalism. Capitalism is not consumerism. So capitalism in the United States developed in part as a response to the need to oppose privilege privileged commercial putting out and colonial forms of capitalism. This reflects a long history of capitalism's tendency to contradict itself and self-undermine in order to expand. Before the rise of religious notions of divine calling to work propelled capitalism in America, capitalism is in 17th century Holland exhibited a very different character than commonly assumed. Its economic strength was not attributed to irrational consumption or production, but to a highly rational mechanism. Sir William Petty credited Holland's economic power to the presence of numerous dissenters, Calvinists and Baptists, who were for the most part thinking sober men and such as believe that labor and industry is their duty towards God. Similarly, Puritans, much like contemporary democratic ecologists, rejected any association with the large-scale capitalism courtiers and projectors whom they viewed as ethically suspect. Yet they took pride in their own superior middle-class business morality, which they argued was the real cause of their persecution. All this is Weber. Defoe even advocated for combating dissent by boycotting bank credits and withdrawing deposits. Throughout history, differing capitalist attitudes have closely intertwined with religious differences. Capitalism in turn has required an ethical framework that contradicts the logic of excess and impersonal production chains in order to establish commodification within social relations of production. Reading Indigenous or any sort of religious-based notions of opposition to consumerism strictly as opposition to capitalism is therefore a widespread misconception, even within today's post-Marxist academia. Historically, these logics have often coexisted and aligned rather than being outright opposed, just as Kimeter describes gifts as existing in a realm of humility and mystery. Marx would describe the commodity as therefore a mysterious thing abounding in theological niceties. Commodities are not, as Kimeter suggests, different from gifts because they establish a feeling bond between two people, nor are they private commodities. According to Marx, commodities are precisely social things whose qualities are at the same time perceptible and imperceptible by the senses. Commodification is not simply the materialization of natural products. Commodities have absolutely no connection with their physical properties and with the material relations arising therefrom. A commodity is a definite social relation between people that assumes, in their eyes, the fantastic form of a relation between things. Hence, in a Marxian framework, there is no such thing as private commodity. My third line of reasoning is on paying gringa prices and retaining prestige. The market day in the local village, as described in The Gift of the Strawberries, particularly exemplifies how the argument of a gift economy is strategically placed within a purely capitalist context. Kimeter writes that during her trips to the Andes, she knew that I paid the gringa prices, but the experience of abundance and goodwill were worth every peso. End of quote. Later, she writes that she dreamed not long ago of that market with all its vivid textures. And by the way, I realized that during the book this was a dream and not something real, just because I had to go back and read again. And only now in dreams can she envision a gift-based market where merchants act as intermediaries, where the world is a gift in motion, she writes. How wealthy we become. Yet, Her gift-based economy dreams do not correspond to what gift economies are understood to be within scientific materialist thinking. They are quite literally dreams. She quotes the poet Lewis Hyde on his work The Gift, where drawing on the teachings of the Reformation within the Catholic Church, the central question shifts from can gifts and commodity coexist to what degree may one dream from the other, to what degree may one draw from the other without destroying it, arriving at a simple, though fraught, solution. First, the artist, this is a quotation from Hyde, allows himself to step outside the gift economy that is the primary commerce of his art and make some peace with the market, like the Jew of the Old Testament who has a law of the altar at home and the law of the gate for dealing with strangers. The artist who wishes neither to lose his gift nor to starve his belly reserves a protected gift sphere in which the work is created, but once the work is made, he allows himself some contact with the market. And then the necessary second phase, if he is successful in the marketplace, he converts market wealth into gift wealth. He contributes his earnings to the support of his art. Every step of the way, it becomes clear that what Kimmerer and Hyde mean by gift economies has little to do with actual gift economies as studied in anthropology or historical materialism. Marx himself acknowledged the presence of commodities even at the fringes of the Peruvian Inca state, where private property had not yet fully emerged. Even in the absence of a fully crystallized money form, the exchange value of commodities was already historically in formation. To a higher degree of abstraction. Within this context, the simplistic definition of the gift as something that cannot be bought falls short of capturing the real social and economic dynamics at play. I quote again, the exchange of commodities, and this is a quotation from Marx. Yes, quotation from Marx. The exchange of commodities, therefore, first begins on the boundaries of such communities, at their points of contact with other similar communities, or with members of the latter. So soon, however, as products once become commodities in the external relations of a community, they also, by reaction, become so in its internal intercourse. The proportions in which they are exchangeable are at first quite a matter of chance. What makes them exchangeable is the mutual desire of their owners to alienate them. Meantime, the need for foreign objects of utility gradually establishes itself. The constant repetition of exchange makes it a normal social act. In the course of time, therefore, some portions at least of the products of labor must be produced with a special view to exchange. So, when Kimmerer writes about commodities, she is not engaging with commodities in the materialist Marxian sense. Likewise, when she describes gift economy, she is not referring to historically studied gift-based economies or systems. Rather, what Kimmerer articulates is a shift in perspective, an ethical and aesthetic reorientation that makes the world appear as if it is a gift. I quote her. It is human perception that makes the world a gift. When we view the world this way, strawberries and humans alike are transformed. The relationship of gratitude and reciprocity thus developed can increase the evolutionary fitness of both plant and animal species, and the culture that treat the natural world. Just imagine that term, the evolutionary fitness, put in another context or put in another tradition of thought would be criticized immediately. The evolutionary fitness. So I continue reading. Species and the culture that treat the natural world with respect and reciprocity will surely pass on genes to ensuring generations with a higher frequency, to ensuing generations with a higher frequency than the people who destroy it. The stories we choose to shape our behaviors have adaptive consequences. So it's like eugenetics with stories, with ideology. The capitalist goal of Kimeter's book is in plain sight. The evolutionary fitness of both plants and human animals, an evolutionary optimum. The critical question we must ask is fitness for what? Fitness to sustain capitalism under its current and future conditions. She is clearly, again, quite overtly not attempting to subvert the foundational economic structures of domination. Her interest lies merely in an ideological shift, in giving the world a new appearance, a new aesthetic and mind-centered facade for an economy still fundamentally driven by the market. I quote her again. I know that we cannot all become hunter-gatherers. The living world could not bear out weight. But even in a market economy, can we behave as if the living world were a gift? End of quote. This scientific idea of evolutionary fitness, coupled with the social ideal of optimal reciprocity, which is almost parodically portrayed in Kimeter as saying I love you to a vegetable garden, so that it reciprocates in production, reflects a shift in the organizational principle of Western society, an effective economic shift. Natural sciences and the axioms they have validated have served as a key resource in delimiting the governing principles of society since the 20th century. Just as the liberal art of governing relied on a principle of organization in the application of society of a schema of rationality specific to nature, the principle that ultimately led to Nazism. Kimeter's principle of limitation merely replaces the epistemic horizon of what science signifies and substitutes rationality with reciprocity. Reciprocity becomes the new organizing experiential logic that governs our relation to economic structures beyond our agency. If we live in reciprocity with the earth, then economic structures require no modification. From the side of perception, we can observe that even the Penn State University Library website published a commandment-like individual action steps in a companion guide to the book. It says, recognize objects in the material world as gifts and make an effort to learn where they come from. For example, where does my daily coffee come from? What about the computer I'm using to read this post? The displacement of rationality toward reciprocity, which is by no means devoid of organizing or rationalizing principles, is also evident in Haidt's The Gift, where he offers remarks on the perspectival shifts scientific communities must undergo to generate social repercussions beyond mere utility. In these sections addressing the scientific community, particularly in the United States, Haidt aligns the form of the gift with interinstitutional sharing practices, even as these institutions remain fully embedded within and historically reflective of the capitalist structures at their core. In doing so, he locates both his own thought and Kimeter's within the proximities of what Humphrey terms bioregionalism, a narrowing of the scope through which we conceptualize the economy, and notions such as the gift or commodity to a strictly local frame. In this framing, the structural conditions of our local perception is effectively removed from this equation. He writes, as a geneticist at MIT, Dr. Jonathan Kind remarked, in the past, one of the strengths of American biomedical science was the free exchange of materials, strains of organisms, and information. But now, if you sanction and institutionalize private gains and patenting of microorganisms, then you don't send out your strains because you don't want them to be in the public sector. That's already happening now. People are no longer sharing their strains of bacteria and the results as freely as they did in the past. Then, in a conceptually strained leap, Hyde defines the gifts as anarchist property. Yet, even a cursory reading of Mary Douglas's foreword to Mauss's The Gift makes clear that anarchy within the economic history of the West has historically referred to not to egalitarian or communal exchange, but rather to laissez-faire economics, social atomization, and the exploitation of the poor under industrial capitalism. Furthermore, the editorial note to The Gift offers a brief commentary on the translation of the North American indigenous terms potlatch, highlighting that indigenous gift economies were not, in their social dimension as distinct from religious practice, oriented towards ecological balance. Instead, they were often characterized by forms of conspicuous consumption and instrumental reciprocity. I quote here part of that introduction. Various definitions of it are given in the text: systems for exchange of gifts, as a verb, to feed, to consume, a place of being satiated. As elaborated by Mauss, it consists of a festival where goods and services of all kinds are exchanged. Gifts are made and reciprocated with interest. There is a dominant idea of rivalry and competition between the tribe or tribes assembled for the festival, coupled occasionally with conspicuous consumption. End of quote. It is striking how both Kimmerer and Hyde depict the gift and reciprocal relations with the earth as innocent and structurally transformative forces, despite the familiarity with and frequent citation of Mauss's The Gift. In the concluding sections of The Gift, Mauss directly addresses the question of disinterestedness, noting that in the indigenous societies he describes, individuals were indeed motivated by self-interest, albeit not in the same form as that which characterizes capitalist economies. Once again, the logic of the gift is shown to be deeply entangled with forms of unrestrained consumption, albeit consumption mediated by an aestheticized register and grounded in a stabilizing social function. As Mauss writes, it was only through exchange that people learned to create mutual interests, giving mutual satisfaction and in the end to defend them without having to resort to arms. His description of gift practices among the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest emphasizes the establishment of social hierarchies through acts of destruction, thereby underscoring the complex and often violent social dynamics embedded in economics of reciprocity. I quote, "The purely sumptuary form of consumption, which is almost always exaggerated and often purely destructive, in which considerable amounts of goods that have taken a long time to amass are suddenly given away or even destroyed, particularly in the case of the potlatch, give such institutions the appearance of representing purely lavish expenditure and childish prodigality. In effect and in reality, Not only are useful things given away and rich foods consumed to excess, but one even destroys for the pleasure of destroying. For example, the Tsimshian, Tlingit, and Haida chiefs throw these copper objects and money into the water. The Wakutl chiefs smash them, as do those of the tribes allied to them. But the reason for these gifts and frenetic acts of wealth consumption is in no way disinterested, particularly in societies that practice the potlatch between chiefs and their vassals, between vassals and their tenants. Through such gifts, a hierarchy established. To give it is to show one's superiority, to be higher in rank, magister, to accept without giving in return, or without giving more back, is to become client and servant, to become small, to fall lower, minister. Quotation from Maus, page 95 of the gift. Just as capitalist economies are structured around the distinction between exchange value and use value, gift-based economies, as Maus observes, are characterized by a parallel distinction between use value and what might be termed retained prestige value. Prestige and gift are intimately connected, and this dynamic is readily apparent in Braiding Sweetgrass, though veiled beneath Kimeter's softened and palatable prose. Reflecting on the extraction of life from the trees that constitute a stack of paper, she remarks, "Fortunately, there is a stack labeled recycled, so I choose those, paying a little more for the privilege. The concept of prestige here recasts as ethical distinction is embedded in what she terms the honorable harvest, a framework that seeks to imbue consumer practices with moral resonance. In a moment that typifies this ethos, Kimeter contemplates how monetary transactions might be transformed into acts of social honor. How can I bring honor to this purchase? Use my dollars as the currency of honor when the lives behind the product are invisible. I stand there so long that an associate comes to ask if I'm looking for anything in particular. I guess I look like as a shoplifter planning a heist of writing instruments with my little red basket. I'd like to ask them, where did these things come from? What are they made of? And which one was made with a technology that inflicts minimal damage on the earth? This passage, while couched in anecdotal humor, reveals a deeper commitment to the symbolic economy of ethical prestige, a logic structurally continuous with systems Maus describes, albeit recalibrated for a liberal consumer consciousness. My fourth line of reasoning is Kimeter's anti-human chauvinism, which could be the most polemic line of reasoning. In Kimeter, the animacy attributed to the earth, which prompts a shift in the mindfulness of the upper middle class consumer, liberal consumer, resonates with what Humphrey terms anti-human chauvinism. This concept denotes a dogmatic or unreflective relation of human interests, desires, or ethical standing, an unreflective rejection of human interests, desires, or ethical standing, a kind of reverse speciesism where humans are not just the center but implicitly devalued. The terms mindful and mindfulness recur throughout Braiding Sweetgrass, signaling the book's intent to effect a transformation of consciousness rather than a structural and material conditions. Yet Kimeter herself acknowledges the limitations of this approach. She says, "But being mindful in the vast network of hyper-industrialized goods really gives me a headache." What a problem. Yeah, I suppose to. The higher middle class, liberal, mindful subject is compelled to reflect on her shopping basket for a mere 5 minutes, a symbolic gesture that foregrounds the limits of ethical consumerism. By constructing nature as a fetishized other, Kimeter simultaneously diminishes the anthropocentric primacy, the centrality of the human subject in Western thought, through the rhetorical relocation of storytelling agency to plants. And I quote Kimeter here. In the Western tradition, there is a recognized hierarchy of beings with, of course, the human being on top, the pinnacle of evolution, the darling of creation, and the plant at the bottom. But in the native ways of knowing, human people are often referred to as the younger brothers of creation. We say that humans have the last experience with how to live and thus the most to learn. We must look to our teachers among the other species for guidance. End of quote. A fetish is defined as a solid object whose stable presence conceals its social mediation. In this sense, Kimeter's book itself functions fetishistically. It perceptually pacifies the contradictions of capitalism, arresting human perception, focusing on plants before these contradictions can be fully apprehended, and instead overlays them with an ethical veneer. Moreover, it produces a dangerous image of the author by fetishistically objectifying those who refuse to adopt this posture of mindfulness toward nature. The working and middle class consumer, as well as the scientist, assumes the form of the foreign intruder who disrupts and corrupts the harmony of the social order, which is ultimately a fetishistic objectification, a substitution for the inconsistency of the social order itself, of the immanent antagonism class struggle that generates its instability. This false opposition exposes the ideological nature of the subject who reads and reverses Kimeter's ideas, and reveres Kimeter's ideas. The ideological subject, and I quote Zizek here, is incapable of grasping how their entire identity depends on what they perceive as an obstacle. End of quote. Kimeter's capitalization of plant names to confer personhood, a strategy that is ideologically insufficient yet highly effective, also exemplifies, I quote Zizek again, the basic premise of discursive materialism, to conceive of language as a mode of production and to apply it to the Marxian logic of commodity fetishism. End of quote. Taken together, Kimeter's work manifests fetishism in multiple dimensions. It's a book that exudes fetishism, and that explains, that was my curiosity when I saw this really weird attitude of everyone in that class toward the book, and when they were speaking with this high solemnity about the book and about how it subverts the way of Western thought about it. And I thought, oh my God, just be a little critical, for God's sake. This decentering of the human coincides with a critique and partial dismantling of Western society. I quote, the botany I was taught was reductionist, mechanistic, and strictly objective. Plants were reduced to objects, they were not subjects. End of quote. The notion of, well, and we know that making plants subjects and rivers subjects and mountains subjects is a current attempt of branches of the humanities that don't realize that this making the entire earth a subject is the dream of totalitarianism, but that's another topic. I continue. The notion of anti-human chauvinism emerges in Kimeter's work as a constellation of ecological positions that risk becoming morally rigid, self-righteous, or overly simplistic in their imperative to reverse human dominance. In doing so, these positions risk replicating exclusionary and hierarchical logics, albeit inverted, thereby perpetuating a comparable form of essentialism. A similar dynamic occurs with the concept of personhood, which conflates the notion of the human with that of personhood. Here is one of the flaws, the huge flaws. I remember that in that class, one of the students I had a conversation with, when I commented this, his answer was, but why would you bring always the reference of the white guys, of the white men? Well, because sometimes Hegel, as always, has the reason, and it doesn't matter where he comes from. Well, it does matter, but don't be so simplistic, just rejecting his ideas because you are an identity politics, the ideological subject. So, to continue, yet within the Western philosophical tradition, personhood fundamentally designates the material conditions necessary for freedom within a society. As Hegel articulates, it is clear at least that personality alone confers a right to things, and consequently that personal right is in essence a right of things. Thing, Sache, being understood in its general sense as everything external to my freedom, including even my body and my life. So if people actually read the things that they criticize so passionately, they would know that Hegel wrote about property, that it includes even my body and my life. I don't want to extend too much in this. This right of things is the right of personality as such. Moreover, property is not merely reducible to subjective personality. The rational aspect, and I quote Hegel again, of property is to be found not in the satisfaction of needs, but in the superseding of mere subjective personality. So people forget, because they don't read the things that they actually criticize, that property has a rational objective side that is not related at all with the satisfaction of personal needs, and that exceeds personality and subjectivity. Kimeter's approach to this conceptual field is far from being serious, systematic, or even literary. The Western notion of personhood is, as a result of these conflations, often juxtaposed with sentientism, a position that, while implicitly utilitarian, asserts that all sentient creatures can suffer and equal suffering should count equally in the utilitarian calculus. So we reject the highly complex conceptual structure that was developed over thousands of years for a simplistic utilitarian notion that is implied in the word suffering, or the ability to suffer, or the ability to feel something. So I have some conclusions, but I would just like to end here. It's been too long, 40 minutes or something. Yeah, I really think it's useful for us to read these kinds of books at the university, because it helps us analyze culture And then it shows how there's a shift happening within Western ecocritical literature. There's a shift towards an emphasis on states of mind or awareness, akin to a form of wokism. And here is with the ends meet, because this proposal of planting a garden on the back of your house is very similar to Jordan Peterson saying just to a 15-year-old man, ignore the structural conditions of your life, just go clean your room. And you'll see how you feel after that. So Kimeter is like the Jordan Peterson of ecological thinking. This shift reconceives the gift as a perceptual relation divorced from capitalist mediation. Such a transformation proves difficult to challenge directly, as it hinges on the reader's fetishistic objectification of both the text and its palatable indigenous adaptations. Consequently, readers maintain a fetishistic relationship not only with Braiding Sweetgrass, but also with the sanitized indigenous ethos it contains. That's the end. If you listen to all of this, thank you for listening, and I really appreciate if you comment or let me know what you think about this, because I'm really curious to know what the percentage of people who still defend this book is actually in the real world, and if there are reasonable points of view that I can discuss with that still, find value in cultural production such as this one.